In a small school cafeteria, no one spoke to the millionaire's son, until a poor little girl with only a piece of bread sat beside him and whispered, "Let's eat together." What happened next melted the millionaire father's heart forever. This is not just a story of children sharing food. It's a story of kindness, innocence, and the power of love that can change lives. Stay with us till the end, because the lesson this story carries will touch your heart and inspire hope in today's world. Jacob's world was wrapped in gold, but his little heart felt empty. At just 6 years old, he lived in a mansion that looked like a palace, with glass windows that sparkled like diamonds under the sun. The long hallways echoed with silence instead of laughter. He had toy cars that could fill an entire garage, but not one friend to race them with. He had trains that circled tracks endlessly, but no one to cheer as the whistle blew. Every morning, his nanny dressed him in neat, expensive clothes, polished shoes, and combed hair that looked perfect. But his eyes were always sad. At school, children looked at him with a mix of curiosity and distance. Some whispered, "That's the millionaire's son," while others pulled their friends away. It wasn't his fault, but the invisible shadow of his father's fortune followed him everywhere. When teachers asked the children to sit in groups, Jacob often sat alone. His small hands played with pencils, his eyes fixed on the floor, while other kids laughed together. At lunchtime, the smell of hot food filled the cafeteria. Children shared sandwiches, traded cookies, and giggled at silly jokes. But Jacob? He sat in the corner with untouched food, carefully packed by a chef. The meals were beautiful, golden apples, little cakes, even chocolates imported from far away, but no one dared to sit near him. It was as if he was a prince in exile, separated not by walls, but by fear and misunderstanding. The boys thought he wouldn't want to play tag. The girls thought he wouldn't want to share crayons. No one ever asked because money had built a wall higher than any fence. Inside that little boy's heart, loneliness grew heavier each day. Sometimes, when no one was looking, Jacob pressed his tiny hand against his chest, wishing it didn't hurt so much to be unseen. He longed to hear his name spoken with warmth, not whispers. He longed to share his toys, not guard them. He longed to laugh until his cheeks hurt, not cry silently in his pillow at night. At home, the mansion was filled with lights, but none of them warmed his heart. Richard, his father, loved him dearly, but Richard was a man buried in work. The millionaire believed he was giving Jacob the best life, a life without need, without struggle, without pain. But he didn't see that his son's biggest hunger was not for food, toys, or clothes. It was for love, friendship, and the gentle touch of someone who saw him as just Jacob, not the rich boy. Every day felt the same, and the loneliness wrapped tighter around him. Jacob often pressed his face against the window, watching other kids play outside. He imagined running with them, chasing butterflies and falling in the grass. But imagination was not enough. His world was golden, but it was also empty. The silence in his life grew so loud that even his heartbeat sounded like a lonely drum. The nights were worse. He hugged a stuffed bear, whispering secrets no one else could hear. "Why don't they talk to me?" he asked the bear. The bear, soft and silent, had no answers. The emptiness in his small chest deepened. But he still hoped. Somewhere, deep inside, he wished for a miracle, someone who would look past the money, past the mansion, past the name. Someone who would look at him and simply say, "Hi, Jacob. Let's play." That hope flickered quietly like a candle in the dark. He didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change. A piece of bread carried in the tiny hands of a poor girl was going to tear down the walls around his heart. But for now, Jacob sat alone, lonely in his golden world, waiting for the day someone would finally see him. One afternoon, the schoolyard buzzed with children's voices. The swings creaked, jump ropes slapped the ground, and laughter filled the air. But Jacob sat alone on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his lunchbox unopened. His blue eyes wandered across the playground, watching groups of children chase each other, but no one came near him. He felt invisible, as if he were trapped behind glass. Just then, a small figure caught his eye. A little girl, about his age, sat under a tree with her knees pulled to her chest. Her dress was simple, a little worn at the hem, and her shoes looked older than the other kids. but her face glowed with quiet courage, and her eyes sparkled with warmth. Her name was Doris. In her tiny hand, she held a single piece of bread. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't buttered. It wasn't wrapped in shiny paper like Jacob's meals. It was plain and simple, but it was hers. She chewed slowly as if she were grateful for every bite. Jacob couldn't look away. He thought of the untouched meals in his box, meals he never finished because eating alone always felt tasteless. For a moment, he felt ashamed of how much food he had while she had only a piece of bread. Doris noticed him staring. Most children, when they looked at Jacob, quickly turned away, but not her. She tilted her head, studying him, noticing the sadness in his eyes. Something inside her tiny heart whispered, "He looks lonelier than me." She stood up. Her small shoes crunched on the gravel as she walked across the playground. Each step was bold, though her hands trembled slightly. Jacob's heart raced. No one had ever walked toward him like this before. He thought maybe she would mock him, maybe say something cruel like others did. But instead, Doris stopped in front of him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with the innocence only a child could carry, she broke her bread in half. She held out the piece with a soft, brave smile. "Let's eat together," she whispered. Jacob froze. No words came out of his mouth. He stared at the small piece of bread resting in her hand, as if it were a treasure more valuable than all the gold in his father's house. His throat tightened. His chest ached. "Go on," she said gently. "It tastes better when you share." Her kindness wrapped around him like a blanket. His tiny fingers reached out slowly, trembling as they touched the bread. When he took it, Doris smiled wider, and Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt seen. The playground noise faded into the background. The laughter of others, the clatter of swings, it all disappeared. For Jacob, there was only this moment, a girl who had little, offering him more than anyone ever had. A piece of bread and friendship. He bit into it. It was simple, soft, and warm. But in Jacob's heart, it tasted richer than all the cakes, chocolates, and fruits he had ever eaten. It tasted like hope. Doris sat beside him, nibbling her half of the bread. For the first time, Jacob didn't feel invisible. For the first time, his lunch break wasn't silent. And for the first time, a smile stretched across his face. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple act, sharing bread, was about to change both of their lives forever. Jacob held the little piece of bread in his small hand for a long moment. It was just bread, but to him it felt heavier than gold. He looked at Doris, her eyes shining with kindness. And something inside his heart whispered, "Don't let this moment go." He took a bite. The bread was plain, but as he chewed, his chest filled with warmth. For the first time, food didn't feel like something to be swallowed alone. It felt like a bridge between his lonely world and hers. "Do you like it?" Doris asked, her voice light as a feather. Jacob nodded quickly. It's the best thing I've ever had." She giggled, covering her mouth. "It's just bread." But Jacob shook his head, his face serious. "No, it's special, because you shared it with me." Her smile softened. Friends share, don't they? The word friends hit Jacob's ears like music. He repeated it in his head. Friends, friends, friends. He had never tasted that word before, never held it in his heart. Now, because of her, he could. The two of them sat side by side on the bench. Jacob opened his lunchbox, for once not ashamed of it. Inside were cakes, fruit slices, and chocolates wrapped in gold foil. Carefully, he lifted out a small chocolate and placed it in Doris's hand. "Here," he whispered. "It's for you." Her eyes widened. No, I can't take that," she said softly. "It looks too fancy." But Jacob pushed it closer. "You gave me bread. This is mine to share, please." Doris hesitated, then took it with shy fingers. She bit into the chocolate, her eyes lighting up. "It's sweet," she said with a little laugh. Jacob laughed too, his first true laugh in months. The sound surprised him. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel lonely. It felt free. He covered his mouth in shock, then let the laughter out again. Doris laughed with him, and soon both children were giggling so hard their cheeks hurt. The other kids on the playground noticed. For the first time, they saw Jacob smiling. Some whispered, "He's laughing?" Others stared, surprised that the boy who always sat alone now had someone beside him. But Jacob didn't care. For once, he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his first real friend. The sun dipped lower in the sky, wrapping the playground in soft gold. Jacob and Doris swung their legs beneath the bench, talking about little things. They spoke about colors. Doris loved yellow, Jacob loved blue. They spoke about dreams. Doris wanted a puppy, Jacob wanted a treehouse. They spoke about silly things, too, like how clouds looked like cotton candy. Every word they shared was like water to a dry heart. Jacob felt alive. Doris felt seen. Together, they discovered a new kind of happiness, one that didn't care about money or status, but about kindness and laughter. And in that simple hour, Jacob learned something he would never forget. Sometimes the richest meals are not the ones on golden plates, but the ones shared between friends. What Jacob didn't know was that someone else was watching from the shadows, his heart heavy with secrets. His father, Richard, had arrived early, dressed in his sky-blue suit. He stood at the edge of the playground, frozen in place, staring at the sight before him. His lonely boy, his silent, sad Jacob, was laughing. And beside him was a poor girl holding half a piece of bread. Richard's throat tightened, and a storm of emotions swirled inside him. He had spent millions to give his son the world, but here, this little girl with almost nothing had given Jacob something priceless. Richard stood at the edge of the playground, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the fence. His sky-blue suit gleamed under the afternoon sun, but his heart felt heavy, darker than night. For years, he had built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal, believing that wealth would shield his son from every hurt the world could throw. But now, as he watched Jacob laugh for the very first time in months, guilt gripped him like a cold hand. He remembered Jacob's empty eyes during breakfast, staring at his plate while silver spoons clinked softly. He remembered the quiet dinners where only the ticking of the clock filled the room, while his little boy pushed food around without appetite. He remembered the questions Jacob never asked out loud, the loneliness that hung over him like an invisible curtain. And Richard, blinded by business meetings and profits, had told himself his son was simply shy. But watching him now, laughing with a girl who had nothing but a piece of bread, Richard realized the painful truth. It wasn't shyness, it was emptiness. An emptiness money could not cure. Richard's mind flashed back to his own childhood. He had once been a poor boy himself, running barefoot on gravel roads. He remembered the taste of hunger, the nights he went to bed with nothing but water to fill his stomach. And he remembered his only friend back then, Tommy, the boy who had shared an apple with him under a tree. That apple had been more than food. It had been love, hope, and brotherhood. His chest tightened as the memory collided with the present. He had become so focused on wealth, so desperate to protect Jacob from the struggles he once knew, that he had accidentally starved his son of the very thing that had saved him as a child: human connection. Richard's eyes stung with unfallen tears. Here was his son, finally alive, finally glowing with joy. And the reason was not the toys Richard had bought, not the mansion, not the expensive food. It was a simple piece of bread shared by a little girl in a worn dress. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. All his millions couldn't buy the smile on Jacob's face. All his success couldn't create the friendship his son had found in a girl who had nothing but kindness to give. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the ache deep inside. Regret whispered in his ear, "You've given him everything except the one thing he needed most." The voices of business partners, clients, and bankers no longer mattered. What mattered was the sound of his son's laughter, ringing like music across the schoolyard. As he stood there, his polished shoes rooted to the ground, Richard felt like two men at once. The millionaire who owned skyscrapers, and the father who suddenly realized he owned nothing of his child's happiness. His breath grew unsteady. A storm of questions raged inside him. How many nights had Jacob cried in silence while he was away at meetings? How many times had his boy looked out the window, hoping for someone to sit beside him? How many smiles had he missed, simply because he believed money was enough? The guilt was sharp, but beneath it was something stronger, a determination beginning to grow. He would not let this moment pass. He would not let his son lose the gift he had just found. If one piece of bread could bring Jacob joy, then Richard would move heaven and earth to protect that joy. From that moment, Richard's heart carried a secret promise. He would not let money be a wall anymore. He would learn from his son and from the little girl who had given without fear. Because deep inside, Richard knew, if he didn't change, he would lose the one thing no millionaire could ever buy. And that was his son's happiness. That night, Richard sat in his study, surrounded by leather chairs and shelves of books that smelled of old paper and dust. The golden lamp cast a glow on the polished desk, but Richard didn't see the shine. He saw only the memory of his son's laughter with Doris. That laughter echoed in his mind louder than any business deal, louder than the ringing of coins, louder than the applause of his success. For years, he had told himself that building walls of wealth around Jacob would keep him safe. No bullies, no hunger, no scars of poverty would ever touch his boy. But now he realized those walls had kept more than pain away. They had also kept away love. Richard leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy. The image of Doris holding out her bread replayed over and over. That little girl had done in seconds what he could not do in years. She had given Jacob joy. She had given him friendship. She had given him the priceless gift of being seen. "Son," Richard whispered into the quiet room, "I failed you." The words trembled out of him like a confession. When he went to Jacob's room, he found his boy fast asleep, clutching the stuffed bear in one arm. But this time, there was something different. Jacob's lips curved into the faintest smile, even in his dreams. Richard stood there, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. The next morning, over breakfast, Richard sat across from Jacob. The smell of warm pancakes filled the air, but Richard's attention was only on his son. "Jacob," he said softly, "do you like that girl? The one you sat with yesterday?" Jacob's face lit up instantly. "Yes, Dad. Her name is Doris. She's my friend. She gave me bread. Can you believe it? Bread. And it was the best I've ever eaten." His little voice cracked with excitement, and his eyes shone like stars. Richard swallowed hard, his vision blurring for a moment. He nodded slowly. "Son, if she makes you smile, then she's special. More special than anything money can buy." Jacob leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Can I see her again? Can I play with her, not just at school?" Richard hesitated only for a second, then made his choice. "Yes, you can, and I'll make sure of it." In that moment, Richard's voice carried a weight of promise. This was no business decision. This was a father's vow. Later that day, Richard went to Doris's neighborhood. Her home was small, paint peeling at the corners, but laughter spilled from the windows. He knocked gently, and when Doris's parents opened the door, surprise filled their eyes at the sight of a millionaire in a sky-blue suit standing on their porch. Richard bowed his head slightly, his voice sincere. "Thank you for raising a daughter with a heart of gold. Yesterday she gave my son something I couldn't give him, happiness." Her parents were stunned, unsure how to reply. But Richard pressed on, his tone humble. "I don't care about wealth or names. I only care that Jacob smiles again. Please, let the children be friends." Doris's parents exchanged a look. They saw no arrogance in Richard's eyes, only a father's raw honesty. At last they nodded. "Yes," her mother whispered. "Yes, let them be children together." Richard felt a rush of relief flood his chest. He had faced boardrooms filled with powerful men, but this moment felt greater than all victories. This was the choice that mattered. The choice to open the gates, to let kindness in, to let his son live freely. That evening, Jacob ran into his father's arms, giggling with joy when he heard the news. "You mean it, Dad? Doris can come play?" Richard hugged him tightly, his own voice breaking. "Yes, son, she can. And from now on, no walls will keep you from the people who make your heart happy." For the first time in years, Richard felt like more than a businessman. He felt like a father who had finally chosen right. The days that followed were unlike any Jacob had ever known. The boy who once sat alone in the corner of the playground now ran across the field, laughing, his hand sometimes clasped in Doris's. They played tag, they shared crayons, they whispered secrets like all children should. And every time Jacob laughed, Richard felt something inside his chest heal, something money could never repair. Richard invited Doris and her family to their home. The grand mansion that had always felt like a silent museum suddenly filled with the sound of children's footsteps. Jacob showed Doris his toy cars, his trains, and the playroom filled with treasures. But Doris never looked at the toys with greedy eyes. She looked at Jacob, just Jacob, and that was all he had ever wanted. Richard watched from the doorway, his eyes damp. He realized he had built the mansion with bricks of stone, but Doris had filled it with laughter. She had given it a soul. At dinner, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He bowed his head and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Not for the wealth he had earned, but for the poor girl who had walked into his son's life carrying nothing but a piece of bread and a heart full of kindness. In school, children who once whispered about Jacob began to see him differently. He wasn't the rich boy anymore. He was the boy who shared, the boy who laughed, the boy who wasn't too proud to sit with someone who had less. Doris had changed not only Jacob, but the way others saw him. One afternoon, as Richard walked through the park with Jacob and Doris, he stopped suddenly. His heart swelled as he looked at them. Two small children, one born into riches, the other into simplicity, yet both equal in friendship. He crouched down to their level, his voice soft but firm. "Children," he said, "never forget this. Money can buy food, clothes, and houses, but it cannot buy love, friendship, or kindness. Doris, you taught us that. And Jacob, you showed me that happiness lives not in gold, but in the people who care for us." Doris smiled shyly, holding Jacob's hand. Jacob grinned up at his father, his eyes shining brighter than any diamond. And in that moment, Richard knew he had been given the greatest treasure of all, wisdom born from innocence. Word of their friendship quietly spread in the town. Some people frowned, saying the rich should stay with the rich and the poor should stay with the poor. But Richard ignored them. He knew the truth. Society builds walls, but children break them down with a smile.